Welcome to the Evolution 2.0 podcast, where we explore the intersection of art, technology, business, biology, and spirituality. Here you'll discover new trends in evolution that are changing the way we think about everything. This is your host, Perry Marshall, author of Evolution 2.0, 80/20 Sales and Marketing, and Guides to Ethernet, Google, and Facebook. I'm founder of the Evolution 2.0 Prize, a quest for the missing link between earth science, the information age, and life itself. Let's join the conversation now.
So Perry actually wrote a book called Evolution 2.0, right?
Yes.
And it was really good. It was really good. It challenges a lot of the kind of modern science assumptions, you know. And as you guys know on this channel, one of the things I do like to talk about also is how you shouldn't just accept what people tell you, like what the news tells you, what science says about things, because it's just, you know, many times it's theory. It's not really truly backed by you know, the kind of rigors. But so anyway, so Perry wrote a article or a paper on biology transcends the limits of computation, and he reached out to me, and I thought this would be interesting content to share. So yeah, welcome back, Perry.
It's great to be here talking to a bunch of programmers, and I wrote an Ethernet book about 19 years ago, and so I've lived in the IT world to a certain degree, and so yeah, there's an overlap. I'm an electrical engineer, biology, code, mathematics, artificial intelligence. It's all kind of in the same wheelhouse. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation today.
Okay, awesome. And yeah, and so we have kind of a mixed audience now. So a lot of, if you guys are wondering, because a lot of you are programmers, you know, Simple Programmer, this channel was Simple Programmer, now it's Bulldog Mindset. So now it's a mix of definitely still programmers. So what is the paper? What is the premise of the paper?
So this was published in Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology, which is a 70-year-old peer-reviewed journal. And there's a bottom line to this, and then I'll unpack it. So there are several bottom lines. Number one is Siri and Alexa are not going to wake up anytime soon. In fact, they're never, ever going to wake up unless and until the fundamental definition of a computer changes. Okay. So like all of this transhumanism and singularity and all that kind of stuff, not going to happen unless, like, we can get to the unless later, okay? But current situations, never, okay? Number two, living things are not computers. They are something fundamentally different, and that has all kinds of implications for psychology and biology and genetics, and we can get into that. And finally, what it proves is that science cannot be reduced to mathematics. There are things in science that there are things in the real world that cannot be reduced to formula. Okay, and so like this changes the definition of science itself. And so so number one, the computers aren't going to wake up. Number two, biology is not a computer. Number three, science has to expand its definitions to account for things that are not computable. So it gets into lots of philosophical things, but even really deep questions of what does it mean to be alive? All of these questions are on the table.
Okay, interesting. I think probably of those three, the one that probably sticks out the most to me is the idea that the living things, or that humans are not, biology is not computers. Because I think so much that analogy has been sort of just put out there everywhere. It's like, okay, well, this is like your DNA is some code, and your cell is a computer that processes that code, and you know, and all of the things that we look at as biology, we always equate it to your brain as a computer, right? It's like, you know, all of these things, right?
That's right. And it's not true. Now, why is this important? Well, because when you assume that something is just a computer, it really dehumanizes humans, and it dehumanizes everything. Your goldfish too, in a way. Okay, so if you go back through the history of science, people always made connected the universe to whatever the latest technology was. Okay, so if I go back 500 or 600 years, when the hottest thing was cuckoo clocks, okay, then everybody thought that the universe was a cuckoo clock. Like,
I see. Yeah.
You go read old books, and 400 years ago, 300 Isaac Newton comes along. Oh, we're making clocks. The universe is a clock. It's all gears. It's all okay, right? And so, look at the solar system. Look at that stuff spinning around. See, it's all clocks, right? And then you get to now, and we're like, oh yeah, DNA is code, which is a thesis of my book, by the way. Yes, DNA is code. Oh, therefore, cells are computers. Well, if you get into physiology, though, what you find out is DNA is not like the ultimate blueprint for everything, and everything doesn't just come from DNA in some linear one-way direction. Actually, the DNA is an organ of the cell, kind of like the hard drive is a component of the computer, and DNA is a read-write mechanism, just like a hard drive is. And cells, they pull information off the hard drive and they do stuff with it, but they also put information on the hard drive, and the cell is in charge of this. And one of the points I'm making with the paper is the cell being in charge of this is something that is completely outside of anything that a computer ever does.
Interesting. Okay.
So there is a paper that came out last year by James Shapiro. James is a bacterial geneticist at the University of Chicago. He's been studying bacteria for 50 years. He's the guy who figured out that bacteria can rewrite their own DNA. So he's a very notable person. The name of his paper he published last year was called "All Living Cells Are Cognitive."
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay. So like bacteria, protozoans, tadpoles, humans, all cells are cognitive, which means they have cognition, which roughly speaking, what he's saying is that they behave as though they have some form of consciousness. Now I'm trying to put this in lay language, okay? And so I'm kind of coloring with a broad brush, but the ability to make decisions in one's own personal interest, which people call agency, is something that's possessed by all cells. So if we go on YouTube and we type in white blood cells chasing germs around,
right?
We watch them chasing each other. It doesn't look any different than your dog chasing rabbits in the backyard. And it doesn't look any different than 6-year-olds chasing soccer balls.
Huh. That's interesting. That's an interesting way to look at it. Okay.
Okay. And so cells have agency, and you go, so you mean my skin cell could make independent decisions? Yeah, and when it goes crazy making independent decisions, that's called cancer.
Right.
Okay, so yes. So cells have being and they have agency, and computers don't. Now, what I did in the paper was I proved this mathematically. Okay, it's not just an assertion, it's a proof.
Okay, so then it's almost like saying your cells, they're trying to do something.
Yes.
It's like, as opposed to, I think where we view it as it's okay, well, it's just a chain reaction of effects, right? Which is so crazy when you think about it. Because I was thinking about this just the other day, and I was like, even just the difference between men and women, like the male versus one XY versus an XX chromosome, like that bit controls so much, but everything else is the same. But then there's these slight differences, and it's like it just boggles my mind. This doesn't seem like it's possible that that slight difference could affect so many things, but then so many cascading things. Because as you get into endocrinology, right, and you look at hormones, and it's like this hormone affects this thing, which affects this thing, which it's such a giant mess of things that that what you're saying about having agency makes a lot more sense. Because if everything if you have all these actors that are all acting towards their own means, then it creates just like what we have now, a community. Like, how do we have networks of people, and how do we have organizations and buildings? It's because every single person in that organization or company has agency, and sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't, but that creates that bigger function, or that bigger entity. And so what you're saying just immediately makes a lot more sense than the way that we've been viewing this model.
Well, you had a great phrase. You said it's just a chain reaction. Okay, and I have a friend who's a medical doctor, and he read my book Evolution 2.0, and he goes, well, your book got me thinking about a bunch of stuff. And he goes, what I realized when I was reading your book is I always thought of cells as wind-up toys. And he goes, well, wait a minute. If all my cells are wind-up toy, then I'm a wind-up toy.
Right.
Am I really a wind-up toy? No. There are people, there are very serious scientists who will tell you, oh yeah, we're wind-up toys. Right. Sam Harris basically tell you that. Jerry Coyne basically tell you that. Oh yeah, like this notion that you're actually making your own decisions, that's just an illusion. That's just the PR department of your, there's some other circuit that's making those decisions, and you're not really in charge. Well, first of all, this is like the most disempowering thing ever, right? Like, oh, really? Like, I get convicted for murder, and I go to the judge, and I go, well, I didn't do it. My genes did. So you should put me in jail, right? Like, that goes downhill really fast.
Exactly.
But I proved this is wrong in the paper because I went back to the definition of a computer, which goes back to 1936, Alan Turing. It's called a Turing machine. And everybody, okay, you want to see a Turing machine? This is a Turing machine, okay? It's got inputs and outputs, and it processes programs. Anything that does that is a Turing machine. And Turing was the guy who cracked the German code for Great Britain in World War II. Really brilliant guy. And he defined what a computer is mathematically before they ever built one. And here's the thing about Turing machines is they only do deductive reasoning.
Right.
And deductive reasoning is when I say, well, my grandpa, deductive reasoning, I say, everybody is mortal, therefore grandpa dies, therefore I die, therefore we all die. And I start from a general and I go to the specific. That's deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is when I go the other way. I go, well, let's see, grandpa died and grandma died and Albert Einstein died and Abraham Lincoln died, therefore everybody's going to die. That's inductive reasoning. And the thing about inductive reasoning is you can never prove it. Like, I can't prove the sun's going to come up tomorrow, right? Computers do not do inductive reasoning, period.
Right.
That you can make it look like they do, but actually you just have to make the rules where the computer will obey the rule and come to the conclusion. But that's all that they do. And biology does something very different than that. And so assigning meaning to symbols or imagining like anybody with a UFO theory of any kind, whether they buy into it or not, is using inductive reasoning because you don't really know, right? So, oh, well, I think they're from the Andromeda galaxy. You are using inductive reasoning to form a theory, and computers cannot do that. So the fact that we're able to form theories and disagree about aliens or anything else like that is proof that we're not wind-up toys.
Oh, that's interesting. And it's interesting also, just like what you said about the people that do believe that, because they don't truly believe it, right? Because like you said in the court of law, because they don't act in that way.
They never act like they believe it.
Right. Because if you truly believe that, then you would get away with whatever you possibly could in life. Like, because there's no moral consequences, there's no ethical consequences, and it's also not your fault. So there's no sense of guilt or shame, because you're just doing what you're programmed to do, and you had no other choice. You couldn't have done anything different. So whatever you've done is absolutely correct. But people aren't living that way. No one is living that way that I know of. I mean, so that's is kind of proof of it. But I like that I never thought of it that way. It's like inductive reasoning is computer could never do that, but yet we do that, and so that's the proof of our autonomy.
Now I'm going to anticipate that some like artificial intelligence, machine learning guys are going, oh yes they can, because good deep mind and it can learn to play chess and everything. Okay. But let's notice what's happening. If you program a computer to learn Go or to learn chess, what you're doing is you're making a situation with a huge amount of memory, like way more memory than a human has. And then
Right.
you're programming it to like backtrack into figuring out what the rules are through a completely deductive process. But what's remarkable about ants and bees and humans and goldfish is they navigate the world with way less memory than
Right.
that, with way less examples. And like most of the machine learning and AI stuff you hear is hype.
Right.
It is designed to attract investors. It's designed to spike the stock market. Every time Elon Musk says, oh yeah, the machines are going to take over, it makes investors put more money into Tesla, which makes self-driving cars, which are ridiculously hard to pull off, right? And so there's a lot of fiction around this stuff.
So that's interesting too. Like, I mean, what you said with self-driving cars, because if you truly can't have inductive reasoning programmed, at least to the degree that we know it so far, then self-driving cars, I mean, they can only make it so far, right? Because it can never make the kind of decisions that a human could make.
Yes.
It can only have like a database of probable of things and how to respond, but like a hard-coded answer of when these conditions meet, and even neural networks, it's just creating that database without knowing what the rules are, but you're still creating rules that say when you have this many drops in this bucket, dump the bucket, or don't dump the bucket, or choose this other bucket.
Yes, and there's no escaping that. Okay, so I think what will happen with self-driving cars is we'll get to the point where they have a program for 99.99% of situations. And then the rest that they didn't account for, the insurance companies will pay for it. Like, I think it's really going to come down to the insurance companies, like, oh, somebody got killed by a self-driving semi-truck. Well, we just pay them like $8 million and the problem goes away, and you just pay the insurance. Like, this is probably how it's actually going to work.
Yeah, and that makes sense, and it makes sense because statistically it would still be a lower death rate, but there is a huge difference between your death being caused by your own incompetence or ignorance or someone else's true incompetence or whatever versus a random like a glitch. There's something to be said about that.
Right.
But okay, so looking at this then with your paper, like breaking down the things about biology transcending the limits of computation, I guess two questions. I guess one, how does it do it? What is the mechanism that, or what do you think it is? And then maybe we can just start there.
So in 1943, Erwin Schrödinger, Schrödinger's cat, like that guy. By the way, his cat's name was Milton. I know a guy who lives across the street in Oxford from where Schrödinger used to live. So the Schrödinger's cat guy, Erwin Schrödinger, wrote a book called What is Life in 1943. So this is before the genetic code was understood. Lots of stuff in genetics was not understood. It's this brilliant book. And he said, living things do something that dead things don't, which is living things turn chaos into order.
Right.
Non-living things, it's always order goes to chaos. And he goes, so what do we call this? He called it negative entropy.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay, like entropy is gas turns into exhaust, and exhaust never turns back into gas, right?
Right.
In the heat, your toast always gets cold when you pop it out of the toaster. It doesn't get hotter, right? That's entropy. And Schrodinger said living things have negative entropy, which has now been mathematically defined. They do it. Most scientists agree they do it. Nobody knows how.
Okay, right.
Like, full stop. Nobody knows how. Well, so we have, in my opinion, we have 6 huge unanswered questions in science. Where did life come from? Where did the genetic code come from? Where does the ability to make evolutionary decisions come from? How do you get real AI instead of fake AI? What is consciousness? And what drives cancer?
Right. Okay.
I say these are one question, not 6. And the one question is, what is consciousness? And how does it work? I think consciousness is the answer to all 6 of those questions. Where did life come from? Where did genetic code come from? How do evolutionary decisions get made? How do we get real AI? What is what is consciousness is right the question. And then cancer, which I talked about at the beginning. Like, if you get skin cancer, well, you had some rose skin cells that decided to not cooperate with the plant anymore.
Right. Okay. So then if you base it back, because that makes sense to base it back to that one question, what is consciousness? Because coming back to the idea of the sovereignty, or being actors, right, at every level, then really, that what is this force that is driving those desires, right? Every actor has a desire. What is the desire? What drives that? And that would be consciousness. And so what is the nature of that? That makes sense, because then that would be, because even in the cancer cell example, because I think that was the one that most people would probably be thrown off, be like, well, why does that question of all the other ones? But because if that cell has its own sovereignty and is a free agent, then why is it choosing to do something that is destructive?
Cancer is probably the most readily understandable example of this, because I've got a bunch of friends who died of cancer, and my dad died of cancer when I was 17. And so like I said, let's take my dad. He had cancer in his kidney, and then he got the kidney taken out. So when you go from a normal happy kidney to kidney with cancer, what has happened is some cells in your body got stressed out, and they went into, let's call it like Windows safe mode.
Yeah.
Okay. Like, the computer got stressed out, and it goes into this safer mode of operation. And then the body is unable to get it back out. And the immune system kicks in and starts attacking it. And then this lizard brain cell goes, hey, who are these people coming after me with knives and spears? I'm going to get out my evolutionary toolkit, and I'm going to start engineering solutions to this. And now you're in the middle of the Viet Cong.
Right.
It's like, so then we get chemotherapy and like all this, and radiation, whatever. We start nuking them. Well, now you're dumping napalm on the Vietnamese village, and you're killing a bunch of people, and then you're pissing off the ones that survive. And then the ones that survive, what do? They're like, well, this is guerrilla warfare, man. Like, let's start innovating. And the evolutionary toolkit comes out. So like, evolution is not random. It's not accidental. There's a whole bunch of mechanisms that cells have. This is what Evolution 2.0, my book, is about. And so cancer is like a perfect case study in agency, because when they were normal kidney cells, they were doing exactly what they were told to do.
Right.
A marvelous level of cooperation. It's mind-boggling, right? And then all of a sudden, you got these ugly tumors growing, and your you're watching rogue evolution in real time.
Now, there's two things that come to my mind about this. I guess at the very lowest level, like at the quantum level, and then at the very highest level, maybe it's a simulation or simulations within simulations, right?
Okay.
Because both things could kind of explain perhaps consciousness in that aspect, right? At the quantum level, you have this kind of behavior where there is almost like a consciousness, because your observation affects the actual result, so that the reality, but also it lends itself all the way back up the chain. Is like, if you're saying that that computers can't have inductive reasoning, right? That there's there's some other force. Well, if I just take this world and then I make another world outside of it, then I can now explain all of those things, because now what at this level is inductive reasoning. At the higher level, it's just deductive reasoning, because there's a program that's controlling at the higher level what these programs are doing, or what this happening in this world, right? So that agency, you have free agency within this simulation, but in the other world, it's not free agency. There's maybe a higher level of free agency that someone else possesses that is controlling you or your cells.
Okay, so this is kind of like a Russian doll's problem. Like you can add another layer and another layer. You can make the system bigger and bigger and bigger,
right,
until you get to the answer. There's a real problem with if you just going, oh well, it really is wind up toys, but the wind up mechanism, it's just
high.
And then it's bigger.
Right.
That's really what you're doing. And you can here's the thing, you can never prove it. So what you end up doing is you end up saying, well, I just think the wind up toy is so big, and you're making a hypothesis. And by the way, you're using inductive reasoning to make that hypothesis.
Right.
But you're saying the giant causal chain just forced me to come to that conclusion. And so what I think is interesting is that that's just an atheist version of Christian Calvinism.
I see. Interesting.
Okay, like, I mean, there were theologians that were saying this, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And it's the exact same argument. It's just an irreligious argument instead, but it's not fundamentally any different. But it's still just as disempowering, right? Right? Like, we still lose the basis of all civilization.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I see what you're saying. It's just a higher level up. But I mean, ultimately, everything comes back to that, right? You can always trace it back. It's sort of this, what is it called? It's like a strange loop. Like, everything is eventually a strange loop, because if you keep on going up and up, then you have to get to the real question of, again, which is, what is consciousness? What is the basis of this? An interesting, theory I heard about it. There's this really good book series. It's a little bit wacky, but if you haven't read it, it's called My Big Toe, My Big Theory of Everything. I actually had you've heard of it?
Yeah, I have.
Okay. You should read it. I think you'd find it really interesting. It's a long read, but it goes into a lot of interesting stuff. But in his conceptualization of the entire universe, it is multiple simulations within simulations, right? A different physical reality and non-physical reality, and so on, to probably to infinite. But all of this is God's consciousness, which is a consciousness computer, right? A almost like, you could say, like a mind or spiritual computer that is creating. It's just all just a thought that has like this consciousness being divided up into little things. And then it kind of makes sense almost with what you're saying, is that, like, even at the very cell level, it's still just a piece of the consciousness of God. And so the question that I suppose the answer he would give to your question of what is consciousness is, he would say that it's all one thing, it's all one source, it's all God, it all comes from one giant consciousness that is divided itself into little pieces. And so that's what's driving everything.
Well, I'm a Christian and I don't disagree. I think that's probably about right. And personally, I think that consciousness and agency is a gift from God to living things. And I don't know the mechanisms of how that happened. It's not an accident that you brought up quantum mechanics and the fact that the observer is inextricably linked to the outcome of the experiment, which, people have argued for decades about what exactly that means, but there's no question that it's a fact.
Right, exactly.
The observer does affect the experiment at the quantum level. And so, I think just that, it tells us that the universe is consciousness first, matter second, not the other way around. And I think one of the implications of my paper is that the reductionist view of the world, which is that it's just chain reactions, is wrong. It's flat out wrong.
Yeah. No, and it doesn't hold water to everything that can't be explained.
Right.
Let me see. I got a question here from Shoshone Spirit Beast. He says, if the cells in our body have sovereignty and we have sovereignty, does that mean we could be cells of the planet?
Yes. This is a fractal thing. Okay, so if you want to go down an interesting rabbit hole, go look up the Gaia Hypothesis, GAIA. The Gaia Hypothesis came out in the 1960s, and by a really brilliant guy named James Lovelock, who said, he goes, based on everything I can see, the Earth, for all practical purposes, functions like an organism. Like, you regulate your temperature, the Earth regulates its temperature. You regulate the oxygen in your body, the Earth regulates oxygen. And people hated this guy.
I'm sure.
Hated it, okay? But then, years go by, and prediction after prediction after prediction after prediction ended up being right. And now it's kind of hard to argue with. Okay, and so, the Earth is an organism, and I'm an organism, and so my cells have mitochondria in them, which are really bacteria, which reproduce on their own. It's like beings all the way down.
Yeah. That's, and it's interesting because when you look at that parallel, I mean, some things make a little more sense because people are always like, I think one of the biggest things that people have against religion is they say, well, or against the idea of God, is they say, well, if there were a God, he wouldn't let such horrible things happen. What about children that die and all these, all these things? And it's like, I mean, at that level, if you really think about it that way, if the Earth is an organism, it's unfortunate when people die, but it's also your red blood cells die, or and it's like sperm comes outside of your body and it lives its own life outside, and then it dies. It's like, or it doesn't die, and then there's new life. And so, at that level, those things make sense because it's not we apply so much value to our own lives and to this experience, but we don't look at because we're just myopic and looking at this level of life, right? Like you said, if it goes all the way down, what about the funeral for the mitochondria that died? You know what I mean? Or at the higher level, we have the whole planet, or the death of species and and organisms in the planet, like collective groups of species. So
John, that's exactly right. And see, I think this is actually essential to understanding, well, why is there suffering? Why is there evil? It's because agency has been granted. It's not an illusion that you and I both decided to be on this podcast today. We're here because we wanted to. We're not here because our genes programmed us to show up. Okay, we decided. Right? We all have some window. I'm not saying we have infinite levels of choice or anything, but I'm saying within a certain band, we got, I could pick A or B. I could click the button and leave this thing right now if I wanted to. Right? And so you have to wrap your arms around it. The love and responsibility and evolution are only possible in a world that has choices.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Otherwise, it's silly, because it's silly to argue otherwise, because unless you're going to behave in that fashion, then to like judge people or to be angry or upset or of any action is ridiculousness, because it doesn't coincide with what your theory of life is. So
Yeah, yeah. So that what a great question. I mean, this is why this is not just trivial stuff. And so, like every piece of digital code is just a trailing indicator of decisions that have been made by conscious beings.
so now, okay, so then looking at this, right? Because and so far no one's ever been able to do it, right? And I could sort of outline the rules for doing this, like for creating life, right? So I mean, at this point we would know that it would need to have the ability to do inductive reasoning,
Mhm.
and also that that it would be able to create reverse entropy. It would be able to create, order from chaos.
Yes.
And so, so that brings up the question, is like, if we just took the simplest life form, right, with the simplest genetic code or simplest brain that we could map out, can we just in the computer map out that exact brain and create that life? Like, if we just use the DNA, for instance, right, can we create life if we have DNA and we can have a cell computer, let's say, that could read that DNA and run that program? Can't we bootstrap life that way?
Well, Craig Venter worked on that very famously in 10 to 20 years ago, and he was making synthetic cells, but he had to do it by borrowing Ferrari engine parts from real living things, right? Like, so his biggest accomplishment, to my knowledge, was that they completely they made a completely synthetic genome of a bacteria, and then they inserted into a real bacteria, took out the old one, and like it actually worked. Okay.
Interesting.
And that's as close as they got. Now, we've never made a self-replicating machine. Like, see, this is really interesting. Like, you could define life as self-replicating, bacteria, right? No human at any level of technology has ever made a self-replicating machine. Nobody's ever figured out how to do it. You can have a very precise definition of a machine. Guess what? There is no precise definition of life. If you put 100 biologists in a room and you go write down the definition of life on a 3x5 card and turn it in, every single one of them will give you a different answer. It's like almost ineffable. It's like, well, life can reproduce. Well, my mom's mom is 90 and she can't reproduce. Is she alive? Well, sure looks like it to me, right? And so these things get very fuzzy.
Oh yeah. Well, even I think most people don't realize that when someone dies, like let's say in a hospital, the doctor just makes a judgment call as to whether they're dead or not. There's no criteria even to define death. To like, you can't say, well, the heart stopped beating, or you can't say the brain stopped functioning, because sometimes the heart and the brain stop and then the person comes back. So there's someone just has to say, okay, well, it's been like 5 minutes since we've seen any kind of pulse, so we're going to assume that they must be dead at this point.
Right.
But yeah, there's no clear definition, no clear test that you could possibly take that would say whether this person's alive or dead.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, isn't this fascinating? Like, who knew that all of these things are wrapped up in the question of like, well, what can a computer do?
Right. So then it comes down to this idea of almost like the chicken or the egg problem, right? Is because what the picture you're painting, at least in my mind, seems to be that that you can't jumpstart the machine of life. You cannot create life. There has to be a spark that you have to have life to create life. That there's no way around this. And so, and so like you could create life from some other life, like even like you said, that bacteria experiment, they had to inject it into a bacteria because it had to have some other component that doesn't exist. That you have to, it can only come from something that already is alive. There's no way to create life without something being alive. And so far there's no one's ever proven that to be false. So,
well, right. So that's called the principle of biogenesis, that all life comes from life. Now, this gets you to conundrum, because like, well, there had to be some place where it started. Yep, that's called the origin of life problem. And it's like, it's probably the hardest problem in science. And like anybody that tells you, well, you know, there was a lucky RNA strand and a lightning strike and it just kind of got started. Hey man, like that is about 97% fiction.
Right.
Like, well, I mean, if you want to believe that, go ahead and believe it. But it's not like anybody's proven that.
Well, and the proof of it or against it is that if that's true and it's like some very low probability event, knowing that and having the technology, then just make the event occur. You've got the resources to do it. You know, it's a lot easier for a sentient being with almost infinite computation power to be able to do that than it is for billions of years of random chance to do it. I mean, that's just the, you know, foregone conclusion. So then the you know, why can't someone do it then?
Well, I'm glad you brought this up because we haven't mentioned that I have a $10 million prize for origin of the genetic code or origin of any code without cheating. And we announced it at the Royal Society in 2019. And it's the largest basic science research prize in the world. It's called the Evolution 2.0 prize. You can Google it. You can find all kinds of stuff. And I got tired of people arguing about angels dancing on the heads of a pin about all this stuff. And I'm like, look, if somebody can figure this out, it's worth a lot of money. It's like as big as Einstein, okay? I can't figure it out, but you know what I can do is I can define the problem and I can put it out there. I can have judges from Harvard, Oxford, MIT, which I do, and like solve the problem, collect the money. If you haven't solved the problem, don't claim that you've solved it. And this eventually led me to these deeper and deeper and deeper questions because like, well, where does code come from? Well, what can code do? What can code not do? That gets you into Alan Turing and all of this stuff. And so it really got me thinking about these big questions. And so there's some possible answers, okay? One possible answer is the laws of physics and chemistry have a capacity for generating consciousness that we don't understand. That's a perfectly plausible thing. Another possibility is that consciousness is an entity that exists in and of itself, which is able to influence matter and energy. And like pick either one of those or both of those trails and start running down them. And so I think it gets you into, well, okay, so you know, which of these theories of quantum mechanics actually makes sense? And there's very interesting people that are working on this stuff. And consciousness is a growing field. And so like somewhere, I think there's some answers to this. And I think my job is to highlight the questions. I think there's not nearly enough people saying, you know, here's a question we don't know the answer to, and here's one, and here's one, and here's one. There's way too many people pretending they have answers that they do not have.
Right. And
what's wrong with an unanswered question?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I like that approach because there's so many people claiming, and it's weird, and it sort of gets mixed up into this whole, like it's this dichotomy, this false dichotomy of, okay, so either you believe what quote mainstream science says without any kind of proof of it. It's not like the rigors of the, you know, of the scientific method for most of this stuff, or you're a religious fanatic. It's like there's no in between. And what I like what you're saying is you're not saying, well, the Bible says this. You're saying this is just explain this then. like make something that makes sense, and I'll accept whatever you say that makes sense. But you know, but I think that it's such a disservice to science that people have this false dichotomy because they don't question the things, right? It's like if you question science as, you know, whatever that is, then you're a lunatic. And I mean, I guess you can see where it's taken us in this age, right? Like, I mean, what's just happened recently, this is crazy because some people just believe science no matter what. And science is such an ambiguous term because it's whatever the people who have the most power say that it is, which has always been the case throughout the world, right? Because back in the day of Copernicus and Galileo, right, science was whatever the people who had power said it was. So
if you want exact answers, I would recommend that you be a bookkeeper, not a scientist. If you go far enough into any scientific field, you will find yourself surrounded with mysteries. And I don't care what branch of science you'd be in: chemistry, biology, physics, astronomy. I mean, we have way less of this figured out than most people think.
Yeah.
I think science is just getting started. Like, we're 300 years after Newton. I think basically we're at kindergarten ABCs of how the universe really works. I think the vast majority of it is still not figured out.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It makes sense. Which, okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of a curveball here, just because I'm curious about your thoughts on this. And people are going to get upset in the comments. I on the video, but I have to ask what you think about the flat Earth, like theory, because it's interesting. Because like my take on it is, you know, I always talk about like probabilities of belief. Like, I don't have any firm beliefs. I have probabilities. So I have a 95% probability of belief that the Earth is round, but 5% that it's flat. So everything that I believe in life there's some probability I associate to it. I never give 100% certainty to a thing. And that's also so that I'm never so religious about my ideas. They're not personal to me because it's just a percentage. Yeah. So the flat Earth thing, some of the stuff that they say, it's like, like, I mean, a lot of it seems crazy, but then some of it, it's like, well, shit, there's no answer to this question. And so I find it interesting to look at the questions that they ask and just that, but what's your take on that? Have you looked into that at all?
Well, I haven't really looked in the flat Earth, and I would go, well, my math would be 99.99% round Earth, or maybe I only get 99.9, like, because I don't know, I've never been more than 10 miles above the Earth. Okay, but let me give you a slightly different example that maybe. So let's take UFOs. Okay, right. So the standard answer is there ain't no UFOs, and it's all okay. Well, I don't know, 10 years ago, a bunch of government information got released. And I remember watching this video, and this guy says, look, I worked in this government office, and there was this room, and they had all this stuff that they had gotten, and I'm going through the stuff, and he's like, man, this is real. And I watched the whole video, and I said to myself, that sounded persuasive. I don't really know. I've gotten to the bottom of other things before. I'm really not sure about this. And my curiosity is like really, my curiosity wheel is spinning really fast here. And I thought, Perry, is this really the thing that you want to go obsess about and figure out?
Right. Exactly.
No.
Not worth it. Exactly.
Okay. And look, there are a lot of things that people make you think that we were sure about, and then we're not. Like, okay, here's a really good example would be dark matter in the universe.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Okay? While the universe is 90% dark matter, it has these certain characteristics. I would not be surprised if that gets completely overturned in the next 25 years and something totally replaces in those dark matter. Oh, those stupid, ridiculous dark matter people. Well, it was a reasonable theory at the time.
Exactly.
And so you have to have some humility. Like, dude, I've not gone down the UFO thing. I don't know. And why do I have to? And why do I have to have an opinion about this?
Exactly. No, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too, but I think the dark matter thing is a ridiculous already, because it's not even a very plausible theory, because when you really look into it, all it is a way to fill in an equation that doesn't work. So instead of saying the equation doesn't work, there must be something wrong, they say our equation must be right, and there must be invisible matter that can't be detected in any way. I mean, that, and then there has to be dark energy to balance out that part of it, because of, so it, to me, it just seems like, you know, someone's making up stuff to fit their model instead. But there's also another example of this, which is interesting too. I don't know if you've heard about this, but you know, plate tectonics, right? Tectonic plate theory. Actually, what's interesting about that too is the guy that came up with plate tectonics, he was ostracized and considered a lunatic, and they basically marched him out of the university, and it was, you know, and then now everyone believes it's true. Yeah. But there's another theory which is interesting, which is hard to refute as well. There's this theory that says that that plates don't actually move. The Earth is getting bigger, and so therefore, like, you look at Pangea, right? And the mathematics work out for it strangely, that it's possible that the Earth is actually just growing in size, and that is causing the continents to pull apart, but the plates aren't actually moving. I mean, there's other, you know, evidences of volcanoes, and, you know, obviously the plate, you know, the stuff that lends itself to it. But it's interesting just to look at that, is that, you know, everything you kind of have to look at it in question. Is like, oh, well, is there another possible explanation for this thing? But most people just accept whatever, you know, whatever they've been told, or, you know, 500 million years ago, a billion years ago, something happened. No one knows. Well,
John, let's point out that what we're doing right now is exhibit A of deductive reasoning. We have a certain set of these small set of facts, and we're trying to figure out bigger, what is the generalized explanation of these facts that don't all quite add up? Like, what is the model that would resolve all of the contradictions? That is inductive reasoning. That is what biology does that computers don't do, right? And so just the fact that we're having this discussion is an illustration of what's very special about life itself.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. I can't imagine. I mean, no matter where we are with computer artificial intelligence, it never comes to this level. There's never, at least, you know, and they're saying that the singularity, that someday it will be, but will it? I don't know, because we're not even one step along the way, right? We're not even close to it, and it's a zero all or nothing game, right?
Well, it has to be able to do inductive reasoning in order to do what we do, or to house, like, there's all this, well, we're going to upload our brain into the cloud and all of that. It's like, well, it's going to have to be able to support this kind of a function, and a computer by definition does not. So no, Ray Kurzweil, there's not going to be a singularity unless, oh, I said, well, I would get to it, unless we come up with some fundamentally different kind of computer.
Right.
Now then, so like, let's say some guy in Sweden figures out consciousness. And he's like, well, guess what? You know, if you line up these atoms in this certain way, a consciousness field pops out, and then it starts making decisions. And like, oh, well, then the next thing, Toshiba is going to put that in a chip, and they're going to like make $1 trillion selling these chips to everybody, right? And then we're in a whole different world. But the computer itself will have fundamentally changed.
Right, exactly. And people think quantum computers would be able to do that, but quantum computers are actually dumber than, because quantum computers just seek to find the lowest energy state, which is not a decision making. It's very quick, and it considers all kinds of possibilities, but it's more brute force than regular computers, because it's trying a bunch of different things and then finding the thing that's the lowest energy state. So at least the way that they work now. But what about a biological computer, like a biological machine hybrid, right? So suppose that you have some cell or some brain that has the power of inductive reasoning, and then you surround it with so much technological equipment and computation power, so now it can use that to create a singularity, or I guess there's even been some movies where that's kind of been somewhat of the plot, like Minority Report. Maybe they had like a psychic human that was controlling all of the stuff, but their power was magnified to become this giant AI machine because of all the computation power equipment.
Well, for years I've had this fantasy. I call it algae on a chip. Okay, and it works like this. So I've always thought, how since I wrote a book on Google advertising, like how would you make a search engine actually smart? Well, what if at Google headquarters you had a chip and you had this little colony of algae, and they were communicating with the circuits somehow, and when a person likes the search result, the algae knows it, and they're like, oh, well, let's make the people happier, right? And then you have a living thing on one end of the search query and a living thing on our end of the search query, and and then the algae colony is like optimizing. I mean, I can't be the first guy that's thought of this. Like, and I don't know how to build it. I don't have any idea, but I mean, somebody's got to be working. It's got to be possible. I mean, how could it not be?
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, that exists already in a sense, right? Because Amazon, they had this thing. I don't know if they have it anymore. It's called Amazon Turk, and there's other technologies. There's this one site where it gives predictions of things, and it basically uses the idea that, like, if enough humans are connected to the other end, they could predict even really weird things, like estimates of things. I read a book about it too, where I know, I read this story about, I can't remember what book it was in, but it was talking about this guy. They had this like guess the weight of this hog thing, and he was at this fairground or carnival, and it was all these like farmers and hicks and country folk, and they're like, none of these people know the fucking weight of they're not going to guess the weight of this hog. There's no way. They don't have they don't have any idea of it. And what ended up happening was he bet that a couple of trained people that had I forget what it was, but non-lay persons, right, experts, could do a better job of guessing the weight than 1,000 random people at a fair. And the 1,000 random people who knew nothing about the weight of a hog, their average guess ended up being more accurate than the expert. And so it's sort of this group computation is, it's like, when you have enough, enough people, enough, of consciousness, like, it is always going to outsmart. It's going to be smarter than the individual.
Swarm intelligence, wisdom of crowds.
Yeah.
Right.
But if you can harness that, then there's some power in that. And that's what I was saying, like with Amazon Turk, is they basically would crowdsource out. You would get paid to do stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And then they had millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people, depending on how much computation, like you're buying human computation power is essentially what it was. And then, they would do, some of it would be simple tasks, but some of it would be solving problems by taking the consensus of this group, of very, very large group. So.
Well, I think that really, like, all of these computational problems are solved by biology, right? It's like, if I hire 6 PhDs from Stanford and MIT and I put them in charge of my machine learning department, I'm relying on biology, because the computers are just an extension of the people.
So let me ask one last question here that I think, because I'm curious about this, on your stance on this, and I'm not sure myself, but okay. So based on everything that you're saying, right? Let's suppose that we had a machine that could perfectly read DNA and then execute those instructions.
Mm-hmm.
If we have that machine that could perfectly read it and then execute those instructions, does that constitute enough to create life?
No, emphatic no.
And why not?
Because we already know that at least half the information that requires to create life is not in DNA. And I'll give you an example. The shape of your body, of having 2 arms and 2 legs and a head and an abdomen, that is not coded in DNA.
Really?
Right. Okay. Let's see. There is a book by, I'll have to get it after the show, but we already know this. It's like it's programmed. It's in the cell membranes or somewhere. It's not in the DNA, and so there's this myth that everything is determined by DNA, and it's just not true. DNA is only part of the equation.
Okay, yeah. See, and that makes sense as to why you can't create that machine. And I mean, the Jurassic Park people are going to be really sad, but but you could still create from quote dinosaur DNA a dinosaur, but you would have to have a lizard or something close to it based on what you're saying in order to, but it wouldn't be the exact thing there. And there's no way to know what the exact thing would actually be, because you would need to have that host to have those other components, like you're saying, that don't exist within the DNA.
As far as I know, that is exactly right. So yeah, boy, this stuff gets really interesting. And the questions, like, we barely even know what organizes a multicellular organism. When, it's one thing to have one cell in a petri dish, but like, how do you get an embryo, and how does all that communication happen? We are babes in the woods on all of it.
And we haven't even talked about the placebo effect as well, which is proven, right? Which again takes just a whole nother layer to it, that there has to be more than just the simple mechanics and of cause and effect. So,
John,
okay.
I love the fearless questions. The way, like, most people haven't even thought of this, let alone have the courage to ask. I just love that we're having this conversation.
Yeah, well, I find this stuff fascinating because I feel like people don't really, they just take so much of the world for granted and don't ask why. Like, why? They just take an explanation, and it's unfortunate, and it carries over in so much of your life, right? It's not just about theoretical things like this, and stuff that you might say might not matter in your life, but it's that way of thinking that applies to business, it applies to relationships, it applies to all of the way that you live your life, right? Getting stuck in the rat race, right? So many people, that's just their, it's the equivalent of that, of not questioning science. It's just the way you're supposed to do things. So.
Yeah, well, that's why we need more entrepreneur thinking in science, because entrepreneurs don't just do what they're told, and we question things, and we need more of it. I mean, dude, we need more of it. Entrepreneurs are so important right now.
Well, I guess we should probably wrap this up here, but I put a link down in the description, guys, for Perry's paper. If you want to go and read through it, it's a little heavy. It is a technical paper, but we covered a lot of what you talked about here. Not the mathematic proofs, of course, but I think that anything else you want people to go check out. I mean, you have your book, right? Evolution 2.0. They can get on Amazon. What else should people check out?
I have a series of blog posts that dissect the paper in much more friendly lay language.
Oh, good. Okay.
And if you go to evo2.org and click on the blog, there's several blog posts called Cancer, Evolution, and the Nature of Nature. And if you go click on that series and read through them, I think there's 3 of them now. I'll probably have 6 or 7 within the next month or so. And I think that will give lay people a much more digestible version of this.
Okay, perfect. I just put the link in the chat for you guys if you want to check that out. And that's pretty cool. Yeah, I'm really interested to see. I was just looking at the $10 million prize on there too. So if you guys want to check that out as well, it's right there. There's a thing, and you can see that it's not BS. It's real. So get $10 million.
It's very real. I have the leading geneticists at Harvard Medical School on my judging panel, and it's in peer-reviewed papers. It's in the Financial Times. It's been in Forbes and Inc. So yeah, it's for real. And yeah, we got $10 million. Like, look, if you can solve this consciousness thing, it's worth at least $10 million. And my investors know that it might be worth more than that. And we're prepared to deal with wherever this thing goes. So,
do you think it'll ever be solved?
I've told my investors I think there's a 10% chance it will be solved in my lifetime.
Interesting.
What I believe is that because we are asking so many questions, we are going to find a very significant something.
Yeah.
Like a really big deal something. And I've already had very interesting people come to me with very interesting things. We have prize entries that didn't win. There's also prize entries that we can't talk about. We're in very interesting conversations with people. I've had numerous like Lee Cronin is a world-class chemist in Glasgow. We did a podcast together. He said, "I'm going to win that prize," and you look that up. So there's very serious people looking at this.
Good. Okay. That's interesting because it's one of those things where I think some people are going to look at it and they're like, oh yeah, this is just some kind of religious, like, it's a tautology. It's not possible. Like there's no solution for this, but that's not what it is at all. And I think that's important that people realize that it's like, it's actual, you want to know the answer. It's not just like being used as a gimmick, but it's a valuable answer to have. So
if 15 years ago, I would have used it as a gimmick and I would have used it. See, I proved God exists. You guys are all stupid. 15 years ago, I would have done that. But the way that my thinking evolved, it was like, no, like we have to take this absolutely seriously as a question. We can't, basically both of the extremes are religious. The atheist view is a religious, the lucky lightning strike and the RNA strand. It's pretty much a religious story. And then you have the other religious story. I'm like, we got to go straight down the middle. We have to respect the questions and we have to respect empirical, factual, demonstrable science. And the way that we get people to focus is by putting money in it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love it. All right. Well, thanks again for coming on, Perry. This has been a very, very interesting discussion. I love having discussions like this. So
I do too, dude. Thank you. And it's just been so great knowing you, and look forward to seeing you down the road, man.
All right. Take care.
Until next time, this is the Evolution 2.0 podcast, bridging science, technology, business, and the big questions. To ensure you never miss an episode, subscribe on iTunes or on your preferred player. If you like the show, rate us on iTunes. Join our email list and social media at cosmicfingerprints.com.